Why a super empath's silent goodbye triggers the avoidant's worst breakdown. When a super empath finally walks away, they don't slam a door, they close it quietly. And it's that silence, that calm disappearance, that sends the avoidant into the very panic they've spent years trying to outrun. There's a moment avoidant partners fear more than conflict, more than emotional intensity, and even more than commitment. It's the moment the super empath, who has tried, understood, forgiven, and given chance after chance, finally decides, I'm done, not dramatically, not loudly, but with a quiet, self-loving certainty. The avoidant doesn't fear losing a relationship. They fear losing the person who made them feel safe enough to try. You see, a super empath loves deeply, not chaotically. They tune into the emotions an avoidant can't articulate. They offer reassurance without being asked. They create a calm space where vulnerability feels possible. And when that steady presence suddenly goes quiet, the avoidance defense mechanisms collapse. The dismissiveness doesn't work. The distancing doesn't soothe. The emotional numbness stops protecting them. Because silence is not an attack. It's a mirror. It forces them to confront what they've pushed away, ignored, minimized, or assumed would always be there. It shows them the truth. They weren't abandoned. They were released. A super empath does not leave to punish. They leave because staying became an act of self-betrayal. And ironically, that's the moment the avoidant feels the emotions they tried to avoid all along. Loss, regret, panic, loneliness, sometimes even love, finally felt, but tragically late. So if you're the super empath, understand this. Your silent goodbye is not cruelty. It's closure. It's dignity. And it's the first step back to your own emotional equilibrium. If you're the avoidant, understand this. The empath didn't walk away because they stopped caring. They walked away because you didn't show them you cared while they were still there. The end isn't always the punishment. Sometimes it's the lesson. A super empath rarely leaves with explosions or ultimatums. They leave with a calm, grounded certainty that feels almost unsettling to the person on the receiving end. For so long, the empath has been the emotional anchor, attuned, patient, and willing to bridge every gap the avoidant created. They've been the one initiating conversations, offering reassurance, and absorbing emotional inconsistencies without expecting the same level of reciprocity. But something shifts internally when they reach their limit. It's not sudden. It's the quiet accumulation of moments where they felt unheard, unseen, or unvalued. And when they finally decide to walk away, they don't need to announce it. Their silence becomes the message. This silence is not a tactic. It's not manipulation or emotional withdrawal designed to provoke a reaction. It's simply the empath reclaiming their inner peace. They've spent so much time tuning into the avoidance needs that they've ignored their own. They've rationalized emotional distance, minimized the hurt caused by mixed signals, and convinced themselves that patience would eventually create closeness. But once the empath recognizes that their compassion has turned into self-sacrifice, they begin to detach in the most natural way, quietly, respectfully, and without drama. For the avoidant, this shift is jarring. They are used to the empath reaching out, repairing damage, smoothing tension, or reinitiating connection after distance. When that pattern suddenly breaks, the avoidant senses a change they can't quite explain. The absence of the empath's emotional presence becomes louder than any argument. Their silence carries weight because it represents a boundary the avoidant never expected the empath to enforce. The quietness feels different from anger. Anger is familiar. Anger still means the other person is engaged, invested, emotionally present. But silence? Silence signals that the empath has truly stepped back. There is no pursuit, no emotional cushioning, no attempt to decode or soothe the avoidance discomfort. The empath isn't withholding anything. They simply aren't giving anymore. This is why the silent goodbye cuts so deeply. It removes the dynamic the avoidant relied on without ever appreciating it. The avoidant doesn't receive a dramatic exit they can dismiss as overreactive or emotional. Instead, they're met with a calm withdrawal that highlights the reality they tried to avoid. that the empath was the foundation of the relationship's emotional stability. Without that foundation, the avoidant is left facing the emptiness created by their own distance, and the silent departure becomes a powerful, undeniable turning point. Avoidant individuals often move through relationships with a belief that independence protects them from pain. They tell themselves that needing less means hurting less, and they often assume they can handle loss because they've emotionally rehearsed distance their entire lives. But what they rarely understand, until it's gone, is that what they fear losing isn't the relationship itself. It's the person who created the one space where their defenses could momentarily soften. The super empath becomes that space. A super empath approaches connection with emotional steadiness and intuition. They sense when the avoidant is overwhelmed, when their walls are rising, or when closeness feels threatening. Instead of demanding vulnerability, they offer gentleness. Instead of confronting fear with pressure, they offer reassurance. This unique blend of sensitivity and patience allows the avoidant to feel understood in a way that bypasses their usual alarm system. It doesn't force them to open up, it simply invites them to. And even if the avoidant never fully steps into that invitation, they feel its safety. This emotional environment is rare for someone who has spent their life protecting themselves from intimacy. The empath's calm presence helps the avoidant feel accepted without performance, wanted without pressure, and cared for without judgment. It's the emotional equivalent of being allowed to exhale in a world that constantly expects them to hold their breath. The avoidant may not articulate this, but they feel it deeply. The empath becomes the only person with whom vulnerability doesn't feel like a threat. This is why the loss of the empath hits the avoidant with unexpected force. They don't panic because a relationship ended. They panic because the emotional safe zone they never acknowledged but always relied on has disappeared. They realize too late that the empath wasn't just patient. They were stabilizing. They weren't just kind. They were grounding. They weren't just forgiving. They were the one person who made intimacy feel survivable. The avoidant may have pushed away, become distant, or minimized the connection, believing the empath would always stay because they always had. But when the empath quietly withdraws, the avoidant feels the sudden vacuum where comfort once existed. The absence of emotional safety is far more destabilizing than the absence of romance. The empath's presence regulated the avoidant's unspoken anxieties. Their departure forces those anxieties to surface without a buffer. In this moment, the avoidant recognizes that what they took for granted was not the relationship structure, but the emotional atmosphere the empath created. Losing that atmosphere triggers the very fears they spent years trying to suppress. Fear of abandonment, fear of inadequacy, fear of emotional exposure, because the one person capable of soothing those fears is no longer there. When a super empath goes silent, it creates an effect the avoidant is unprepared to face. Throughout the relationship, the avoidant has relied on emotional distance as a shield. It's not that they don't feel, quite the opposite. They feel deeply, but those feelings overwhelm them, so they retreat, rationalize, or detach to regain control. The empath has always stepped into that space with compassion, interpreting their withdrawal not as rejection but as fear. They soften tension, bridge emotional gaps, and provide the reassurance the avoidant struggles to request. This dynamic allows the avoidant to maintain their protective walls without confronting the cost of keeping them up. But when the empath finally stops reaching out and chooses silence, everything shifts. The silence is not cold or punishing, it's peaceful, steady, and grounded. And that is exactly what makes it so disarming. Without words, without conflict, without emotional pressure, the empath's quietness reflects the truth the avoidant has been avoiding. It becomes a mirror, one that shows the consequences of distance without blame, and reveals the emotional reality they've been unwilling to engage with. For the avoidant, silence removes the usual distractions. There is no message to ignore, no reassurance to rely on, no emotional caregiving to lean into. It strips away the dynamic they've grown used to, where they could pull back and trust that the empath would close the gap. Suddenly, the space they created is not being filled, it's being left open. And that open space forces them to see the pattern they've been repeating, pushing away the very connection they secretly depend on. In that quiet, emotions the avoidant has suppressed begin to rise. They may feel a sense of loss that catches them off guard, or confusion about why the empath's absence feels heavier than any breakup they've experienced. Their usual coping strategies, numbing, rationalizing, or minimizing, don't work against the power of silence. Silence does not argue. It does not chase. It does not soothe. It simply reflects. The avoidant begins to confront questions they've avoided asking. Why didn't I show more appreciation? Why did I push them away? Why does their absence feel so unbearable? The empath's silence highlights the emotional investment they never openly admitted to themselves. It forces the avoidant to face the truth that their distancing wasn't protection. It was self-sabotage. In this way, the empath's silent goodbye becomes the one thing the avoidant can't dismiss or outrun. It's the moment where their internal defenses falter, not because someone challenged them, but because no one is there anymore to meet them halfway. When the super empath finally detaches, the emotional landscape changes in a way the avoidant never anticipated. For most of the relationship, the avoidant has operated under the assumption that their emotional distance protected them from feeling too much. They believed that by keeping their walls high and their vulnerability low, they could avoid the sting of loss or the discomfort of intimacy. But what they don't expect is that the moment the empath stops giving, stops explaining, and stops showing up, their entire internal equilibrium falters. The feelings they've spent years burying start to surface all at once. The avoidant often experiences this shift as a sudden wave of regret. They realize, often too late, that the empath's presence had a calming, stabilizing effect. When the empath was around, even conflict felt manageable because there was always a sense of warmth behind the tension. The empath cared enough to initiate repair. When that care disappears, the avoidant becomes acutely aware of what they've lost, not the relationship title, but the emotional safety net that made connection feel possible. Regret settles in because they recognize the ways they pushed away someone who was trying to love them, even though that love never demanded more than they could give. Following regret, a quiet panic often sets in. Avoidants are not emotionless. They are overwhelmed by emotions that come in too intensely or too unpredictably. When the empath withdraws their steady presence, the avoidant loses the external regulation they unconsciously depended on. A sense of urgency builds. They might feel compelled to reach out, re-establish contact, or find reassurance that the empath hasn't completely disappeared. The panic doesn't come from possessiveness, but from the sudden realization that the person who once felt like a safe emotional anchor is no longer within reach. Then comes loneliness, a kind the avoidant is deeply familiar with but rarely acknowledges. The empath's absence exposes the emptiness that distancing was supposed to protect them from. They may find themselves thinking about the empath more than they expect, replaying conversations, or remembering moments of comfort they once downplayed. Their goodbye is not an attempt to change the avoidant. It's an acknowledgement that they can no longer change themselves to fit the relationship. For the avoidant, however, the silence becomes the turning point they never prepared for. It disrupts their usual emotional rhythm. They cannot dismiss it as overreaction because it is calm. They cannot label it as drama because it is gentle. They cannot counter it with distance because distance is exactly what created the fracture. And when the empath is no longer there to absorb emotional shocks or provide reassurance after moments of withdrawal, the avoidant is left facing the emotional consequences alone. This is where the lesson begins. The avoidant often comes to understand, sometimes slowly and painfully, that silence was not meant to punish them. It was the empath's way of saying, I matter too. It reveals what consistency looks like by its sudden absence, and what emotional presence means by the vacuum it leaves behind. Without blame, without accusation, the silent goodbye becomes the moment the avoidant realizes the cost of emotional unavailability and the value of the person who once stayed long enough to love them past their fears. In the end, the silent goodbye of a super empath isn't a story of blame or failure. It's a reminder of how deeply our emotional patterns shape what we gain or lose in relationships. The empath's departure reveals truths the avoidant never wanted to confront, and truths the empath could no longer ignore. It shows that love cannot survive on one person's effort, and connection cannot be sustained by one person's emotional labor. When the empath steps away, it illuminates a painful but necessary reality that closeness must be mutual to be meaningful, and vulnerability must be shared to be safe. This goodbye is not about who was right or wrong. It's about awakening. Awakening for the empath who finally recognizes their worth. Awakening for the avoidant who finally feels the impact of their distance. And awakening for anyone listening who may see themselves in these roles and realize that change is possible if it begins with honesty, accountability, and courage. The silent goodbye is not an ending meant to hurt. It's an ending meant to teach. And sometimes the most powerful transformation in a relationship happens after the relationship is over. Thank you for listening, for reflecting, and for allowing yourself to sit with the emotions this message may have stirred in you. Whether you identify with the empath, the avoidant, or somewhere in between, your willingness to understand these dynamics is already a step toward healthier, braver connections. Thank you for your time, your openness, and your presence. Take what resonates, let go of what doesn't, and remember, you deserve relationships where your heart is met, not managed. I appreciate you being here. Take care of yourself. And until next time, thank you.